It begins in silence, the kind that weighs upon the soul. The sound of soft sobbing echoes through the marble corridors of the Topkapi Palace, carried by the wind that whispers across the Bosphorus. Behind gilded walls and silk curtains, beauty was not a blessing, it was a curse. They called it the imperial harem, a paradise for the sultan, but for the women inside, it was a prison of velvet and fear. Each face behind those jeweled veils had a story, of stolen innocence, of survival, and of death that came not with the sword, but with the slow suffocation of the spirit. Tonight, we uncover the darkest side of an empire that ruled 3 continents. The side the poets didn't write about, where love was currency, loyalty was bought with blood, and a single glance could mean life or execution. This is not a story of glory. It's a story of beauty devoured by power, and of souls broken beneath the crescent moon of the Ottoman throne. If you wish to uncover history's most forbidden truths, the kind that still echo through the ruins of Istanbul, stay with us. Subscribe, so you don't miss what the history books were too afraid to tell. Because what the Ottomans did to captured virgins was truly worse than death. The night smelled of smoke and fear. Somewhere in the mountains of Circassia, where the pines grew tall and the moonlight carved silver rivers across the hills, a village burned. The air trembled with the cries of mothers, the clash of steel, and the cruel laughter of men who carried the Sultan's banner, a crescent gleaming against the firelight. They came not as conquerors that night, but as collectors. Each household was searched not for gold or grain, but for beauty. For girls of pale skin, dark eyes, and unspoiled youth, the tribute demanded by an empire that worshipped beauty as it worshipped power. The Sultan's court, it was said, required 100 new maidens each year. And so, the raids never stopped. Among the flames, a young girl named Elira clung to her mother's dress. Her bare feet cut against the frozen ground as they ran between the barns and the fields. The air was thick with ash and the stench of burning hay. Her father had been taken by the Janissaries 2 years before. Now it was her turn to be taken from what little remained of their world. "Hide," her mother whispered, pulling her into the hollow of an old tree. "Do not move. Do not cry. God will see you." But God did not see her. The soldiers did. A rough hand tore her from the hollow. She screamed as she was dragged toward the torchlight, her mother's cries fading behind her. She saw her reflection for a moment in the soldier's blade, dirt on her face, eyes wide with terror, a child's last glance at freedom. Then a blow came to her head, and darkness swallowed everything. When Elira awoke, she was among dozens, girls from other villages, chained together by the neck, the iron cold against their skin. They moved in silence, too frightened to speak. Some were no older than 12. A few wept softly, their tears freezing in the morning wind. The caravan wound through valleys and rivers, crossing lands once proud and free. In towns, people turned away, pretending not to see. They knew what these captives were destined for, the Sultan's harem in Constantinople, a place of silk and sorrow. Some said it was paradise. Others whispered it was a graveyard of the living. Days turned to weeks. The captives were marched by day and confined in wooden pens by night. Food was scarce. A crust of bread, a sip of water. Any who resisted were beaten by the guards, their cries echoing through the camp until they fell silent. One girl tried to run. She didn't make it beyond the first hill. The sound of the whip that followed haunted the rest for days. Elira learned to stay still, to obey, to let her tears fall only when the guards slept. She counted the stars above, whispering the names of her family, afraid she might forget the sound of their voices. The world she had known, of songs, of river dances, of her father's stories, was gone. As they neared the capital, the landscape changed. The mountains fell away, replaced by the vast plains of Anatolia. The air grew warmer, the rivers slower, and at last, one morning, the mist parted to reveal the city of Constantinople. It rose like a dream from the edge of the sea, domes of gold, towers of stone, and minarets that pierced the clouds. Ships swayed in the harbor, their sails red and white like spilled blood upon the water. The guards said nothing, but their pace quickened. The girls were bathed in the morning sun, thin, pale, trembling. To them, The city looked both holy and monstrous. Somewhere beyond those shining walls, their fates were already written. For the first time, Elira felt something colder than fear, resignation. She was no longer a daughter, or a name, or a person. She was an offering. And the Empire was waiting to claim her. The city gates loomed like giants, carved with lions and crescent moons, their ironwork gleaming despite the morning haze. The captives were herded through them as though they were livestock, their chains clinking in time with the march. On the streets, the air was thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and smoke from countless bakeries. Merchants shouted in a dozen languages, yet no one dared meet the eyes of the girls. The whispers followed them, rumors of the Sultan's demand, of the fate awaiting those chosen for the harem. Elira's chains were removed at last, replaced by fine linen garments that smelled faintly of rosewater. It was a cruel joke, soft cloth over tender skin, meant to mask the bruises, the hunger, and the terror. Eunuchs led the girls into shadowed corridors where candles flickered against carved walls, casting long, quivering shapes. They whispered instructions, their voices both smooth and terrifying. Bow here, kneel there, speak only when spoken to. Every movement was watched, every misstep punished. Some girls screamed. Some went silent. Most cried quietly, burying their faces in their hands, trying to will themselves into invisibility. Elira clenched her jaw and forced her eyes forward. She had no choice. Survival demanded it. The eunuchs brought them to a vast hall where mirrors lined the walls. The girls were ordered to look at themselves. Many could not recognize the faces staring back. The marks of the journey, sunburn, bruises, the hollow of starvation, had transformed them into shadows of their former selves. And yet the court demanded perfection. Each girl was measured, examined, and judged by unseen eyes. Their beauty was now currency, and failure meant disappearance into the hidden chambers, from which none returned. In one corner of the hall, a girl wailed as a eunuch whispered her new fate. She was to serve in the inner apartments, the first step into the Sultan's court. The sound of her sobs echoed like a bell, striking fear into the hearts of the others. Elira swallowed her own tears, telling herself that crying was a luxury she could not afford. Night fell over the city, and the girls were moved again, deeper into the palace, where the air grew heavy with perfume, sandalwood, and candle smoke. The corridors were endless, lined with intricate tiles and gilded arches. Footsteps of other women echoed in the halls, older, wiser, some cruel, some resigned. Their eyes, dark and watchful, followed the newcomers. Every glance was a question: who will rise? Who will fall? Who will vanish without a trace? In the quiet of one chamber, Elira was left alone with a maid who spoke softly in broken Turkish. "Do not scream," she said. "Do not anger them. They will take your life before the Sultan ever calls for you." Her words were not threats. They were promises. Elira felt the first true taste of despair. The life she had known, the dreams she had cherished, were gone. She was now a shadow, living in the glow of another's power. Sleep came fitfully, broken by nightmares of chains, flames, and voices calling her name. When she awoke, she found herself surrounded by other girls, some whispering prayers, some shivering in silence. They were all the same, young, beautiful, and stolen from the world they had known. Each face held a story, and yet, in that room, stories were forbidden. Only obedience was allowed. Only silence. The days blurred together. Lessons were taught: how to walk, how to speak, how to attract the gaze of the Sultan without angering him. Some girls learned quickly, their smiles like masks hiding the fracture within. Others stumbled, their missteps punished with beatings or confinement. Elira watched it all, learning the rhythm of fear. And somewhere, beyond the velvet curtains and the perfume, the Empire waited. It did not care for names, for families, for tears. It cared only for beauty and the possession of it. Those who were chosen would either rise into the Sultan's favor or vanish into history, leaving nothing but whispers behind. Elira understood one truth above all: the harem was not a home. It was a battlefield, where innocence was the first casualty, and life itself could be measured by obedience. She closed her eyes, praying not for escape, but for strength. For even in the empire's shadow, survival demanded courage, and courage was often all that remained. The weeks stretched into months, yet the harsh rhythms of the harem left no room to mark time. Each dawn arrived with the same ritual, a harsh bell or the shout of a eunuch, dragging the girls from their narrow sleeping mats into the chill of stone corridors. Breakfast was bread so dry it cut the tongue, water so thin it barely quenched thirst. And yet, no complaint was tolerated. A single misstep could bring the lash or worse, disappearance into the sultan's secret chambers, from which no sound ever emerged. Alira had learned to move like a shadow, unseen and unheard, her body pliant to the demands of the harem's cruel choreography. She watched the older girls, some cunning, some bitter, navigate the invisible rules that determined who would rise and who would vanish. Rivalry was constant, for the sultan's favor was a prize worth any treachery. Alliances were fragile, whispers deadly. In this gilded cage, every friendship carried the weight of suspicion. One evening, Alira witnessed the fate of a girl from her village. Fatima, older and braver, had faltered under the scrutiny of the sultan's eunuchs. A slip of the hand, a tremor in her voice, enough. She was led away through a hidden doorway, her muffled screams swallowed by stone walls. None of the girls saw her again. The lesson was clear: obedience was not enough. Perfection was required, and perfection was often impossible. The air within the palace carried the scent of incense, mingled with the faint metallic tang of fear. Alira learned to mask her own terror behind polite smiles, practiced curtsies, and silent compliance. She memorized the faces of those who would watch her, those who would report her failings. Every glance could be lethal, every gesture scrutinized. And yet she also learned small resistances. The private prayer whispered beneath her breath, the secret trace of her homeland's soil pressed into her palm. These were the fragments of self she refused to surrender. At night, when the palace fell into a deceptive quiet, the girls huddled together in secret corners, sharing what they dared of their past lives. Stories of families, songs, festivals, and the names of parents who might still be alive somewhere beyond the empire's reach. Alira listened more than she spoke. She was learning patience, the weapon of the powerless. Then came the first summons. A eunuch, silent as a shadow, entered her chamber with a silver tray and a folded robe. He did not speak. His eyes were cold, implacable. Alira's heart thudded violently in her chest. She was being chosen. She did not yet know whether it was favor or doom. The line between the two was thin, and often invisible until it was too late. As she approached the inner apartments, the world outside seemed to vanish. Walls of gold tiles reflected candlelight like molten fire. Perfumes, heavier now, clouded her senses. Lutes played softly in hidden chambers, their melodies both alluring and sinister. And somewhere in the vast palace, the sultan waited, a figure of power and legend, whose gaze could grant life or sentence to death. Alira's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Every step echoed in the hall like a drumbeat marking the approach to destiny. In that moment, she realized that survival required more than obedience. It demanded courage and cunning, a mind sharper than the blade that hung over every girl's head. And yet, even as she entered the chamber, she carried with her a fragment of her old life, a prayer whispered for her family, a memory of the forest wind across her village, a vision of freedom that she swore would never die. The empire could claim her body, bend her to its will, but it could not yet touch the soul she had hidden like a flame in the dark. For Alira, the capture had ended, but the trial had just begun. The corridors of the Sultan's palace would test her, and the harem would demand her obedience, her silence, her very essence. Only those who mastered the delicate balance of fear and cunning would survive. And somewhere beyond the velvet curtains and perfumed corridors, the empire's gaze rested, indifferent to hope or despair. Here, in the shadows of power, the first true lesson of the harem had been learned: beauty, once captured, was a gift and a curse, a blade that could wound both its possessor and the one who wielded it. Alira swallowed hard, straightened her back, and stepped forward. The empire awaited. The sun rose over Constantinople, gilding the city in gold and rose, yet within the palace, shadows clung to the walls like living things. Alira awoke to the soft rustle of silk and the distant hum of lutes. The corridors smelled of rosewater and sandalwood, intoxicating, suffocating, a perfume meant to dazzle and distract from the steel beneath the velvet. She had slept on a mattress no thicker than a plank, and her body ached from days of walking, bowing, and endless instruction. Today marked her first public presentation to the harem's hierarchy. It was a procession of flesh and obedience, an exhibition designed to remind the girls that they were not merely human but ornaments, evaluated for every movement, every glance. The eunuchs led them in pairs, their chains replaced by the soft caress of silk ribbons that bound them like birds about to be caged. The mirrors along the corridors reflected dozens of pale, trembling faces, Alira's among them, and magnified their fear 100-fold. The senior concubines watched silently, perched like hawks in gilded balconies. They judged not only beauty but posture, grace, and the ability to mask terror behind a smile. Whispers floated through the air, names of girls who had risen, names of girls who had vanished. The silent message was clear: perfection was expected, and failure meant disappearance into rooms no one ever returned from. Alira's heart pounded as she stepped into the main hall. The walls, inlaid with precious stones, shimmered with the reflection of thousands of candle flames. Soft music played from hidden corners, but it could not drown out the pounding of her own pulse. She forced herself to walk with measured steps, head high, eyes forward. Every movement, every blink, every subtle gesture would be scrutinized. The smallest error could spell doom. She noticed the other girls, some older, hardened by months or years in the harem, some, like her, still clinging to the remnants of innocence. One girl stumbled, her foot catching on the hem of her silk robe. The sound was like a gunshot in the hall. The eunuch beside her struck her hand sharply with a rod, and she crumpled to her knees. Her cries were quickly stifled by another blow. Alira shivered but forced herself to remain calm. Fear was necessary, yes, but panic was fatal. As they moved, a senior concubine whispered to another, "See how they tremble. The Sultan will choose soon. Only the clever will survive." Her words sent a chill down Alira's spine. Survival was not merely about obedience. It required cunning, charm, and the ability to read shadows where no light fell. At the far end of the hall, an archway led to a smaller chamber, where the Sultan's eyes would soon fall. The girls knew it. They had been told in hushed tones that those who passed this procession would be bathed, perfumed, and prepared for his attention. The others? They would be sent to serve in quieter, hidden corners of the palace, or vanish entirely into the labyrinthine depths where no one returned. Alira's pulse quickened, yet she held herself straight. She recalled her mother's whispered prayers beneath the pine trees of her homeland, the cold stone of the tree hollow where she had once hidden. The memory steadied her, a fragile anchor in the sea of fear. When it was her turn, she walked into the small chamber alone. A mirror awaited her, reflecting not just her face, but the weight of what she had become, a vessel of desire and fear, a girl stolen from her village, reduced to an image for appraisal. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to control the tremor in her hands, to project grace even as terror gnawed at her bones. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The Sultan's presence was felt before it was seen, the aura of authority, the silence that demanded attention. In the harem, every girl knew the power of his gaze, how it could elevate or destroy with equal measure. And in that instant, Alira understood the full meaning of the procession of flesh. They were not merely walking, they were offering themselves, body and soul, to the judgment of the empire. The smaller chamber was heavy with scent, rosewater, musk, and something darker, almost metallic, like blood mixed with perfume. Alira's reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, but she forced her chin upward, shoulders back, and fingers poised with careful elegance. Every movement was a test, every glance a verdict. She could feel the eyes of the senior concubines on her, sharp as daggers, noting the tilt of her head, the curve of her wrist, the rhythm of her breath. One misstep, one flicker of fear, and she would be marked as unfit. Behind a velvet curtain, The eunuchs whispered instructions. Walk slowly. Eyes forward. Do not tremble. Speak only when spoken to. Their voices were soft, but they carried the weight of finality. In the harem, obedience was the currency of life. Any deviation could be fatal. Alira's hands shook slightly, but she tightened her grip on the folds of her robe, willing herself into composure. The door at the far end of the chamber opened, and a figure entered, cloaked in shadow and authority. It was not yet the Sultan, but one of his lieutenants, a woman whose role was to decide who would be prepared for the Sultan's attention and who would be left to serve in obscurity, perhaps forever. She walked slowly, scanning the line of girls with eyes that missed nothing. The air felt colder where she stood, and Alira instinctively straightened further, forcing herself to breathe evenly. One by one, the girls were called forward. Some stepped gracefully, hiding their terror behind calm faces. Others faltered. The look of fear betrayed them. A soft sigh, a whispered reprimand, and some were led away, never to return to the line. The sound of their footsteps fading through the corridors was a chilling reminder of what awaited those who failed. Alira's turn came at last. She stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, her gaze locked on the ornate mirror at the center of the room. She measured each motion, letting no fear escape her posture. The woman before her scrutinized every inch of her being, as if trying to see beyond the skin, into the essence of her soul. Alira's chest tightened, the moment felt endless. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, the woman signaled her approval. Relief washed over Alira, but it was immediate and fleeting. This was only the first stage. The Sultan's attention was still the ultimate test, and every girl who had been deemed acceptable here would soon face him. Survival required not only beauty, but the ability to endure humiliation, to navigate rivalries, and to read every unspoken rule of a place built entirely on power and fear. As the day continued, the girls were bathed and perfumed, their hair combed and dressed in silks of unimaginable richness. The fragrance was intoxicating, masking the faint odor of fear that clung to their bodies. They were transformed from frightened captives into objects of desire, yet the transformation was a deception. Beneath the luxurious robes, the chains of their captivity remained, invisible but ever-present. Alira observed the older girls, those who had been in the harem for years, some smiling gracefully, some laughing softly at the newcomers. But even in their apparent ease, there was tension, a constant war of survival played out in subtle gestures, whispered warnings, and carefully timed smiles. Alliances were fleeting, jealousy was constant. The harem was a world within a world, ruled by women yet controlled entirely by the Sultan's power, and the stakes were life itself. At night the girls were confined to their chambers, the soft rustle of silk and faint whispers of prayers filling the air. Alira lay awake, listening to the distant echo of footsteps, imagining the vast expanse of the palace, and the countless eyes that might be watching, waiting for a misstep. She realized that every day in the harem was a performance, a dangerous dance where perfection was demanded and mistakes could be fatal. And yet, amidst the fear and uncertainty, she found a fragile thread of determination. Survival demanded cunning, strength, and patience. The empire had taken her body, but not yet her mind. She would learn the rules, master the art of invisibility and subtlety, and perhaps, one day, find a place in the treacherous hierarchy that governed this gilded cage. Alira understood now that the procession of flesh was not merely an examination of beauty, but a trial of spirit. Those who could endure, who could navigate the web of observation and expectation, would live. Those who could not, would vanish, leaving only whispers behind. The chamber doors closed behind the last girl, leaving Alira in the soft glow of candles and the lingering scent of rosewater. The walls seemed alive with the shadows of the past, whispers of girls who had walked this same path before, some elevated to favor, some erased from memory. The air was heavy, carrying both expectation and dread. In this quiet, the weight of the harem's reality settled upon her like a stone. She remembered the stories the older girls had whispered, rumors of those who had been chosen, yet vanished within weeks, their names stricken from records, their existence erased. It was a power both terrifying and absolute. The Sultan's desire could elevate a girl to unimaginable privilege, yet a single misstep, a poorly timed glance, a tremor in her voice could cast her into the shadowed corridors of the palace from which no one ever returned. Alira's fingers brushed against the silk of her gown, feeling the contrast between soft cloth and the memory of iron chains that had bound her in the mountains. She understood, in that instant, the cruel duality of her new life, elegance and terror intertwined, beauty and imprisonment inseparable. The harem was not merely a place of luxury. It was a battlefield where every gesture, every word, every breath could determine the difference between survival and death. A senior concubine appeared then, her presence commanding, her gaze sharp. She circled the line of girls, inspecting, noting, judging. Alira held her posture, steady as a reed in the wind, resisting the urge to tremble. When the woman finally paused before her, she tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her very soul. Then, with a subtle nod, she motioned for Alira to step aside. The approval was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. For now, she had survived the first trial. Yet survival was only the beginning. The harem demanded more than mere obedience. It demanded adaptability, cunning, and an instinct for survival honed to perfection. Alira realized that she must learn not only to please but also to observe, to read the intentions behind every smile, every glance, every whispered word. In this gilded prison, power flowed invisibly, and those who could not navigate it would perish, unnoticed, unremembered. Night fell, and with it came the eerie stillness of the palace corridors. The distant sound of lutes and soft laughter from other chambers was a haunting reminder that life in the harem continued, indifferent to the struggles of the newcomers. Alira lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling carved with intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. The designs, meant to captivate the eye, now felt oppressive, pressing down with the weight of history and expectation. She thought of her village, the pines and the wind, the laughter of her friends before the soldiers came. Those memories were fragile, delicate as glass, yet she clung to them. They were her last tether to the world she had lost, a reminder that even in this prison of silk and stone, she remained human. Survival required her to hide parts of herself, yet she vowed not to surrender entirely. The empire could take her body, her freedom, even her name, but it could not claim the essence of who she was. In the darkness, she rehearsed the lessons she had learned, the posture, the controlled breathing, the subtle smiles, the silent observation. She understood that each day would demand vigilance, each night a careful preservation of the self that still whispered inside her. The harem was a crucible, and only those who endured, who adapted, who embraced the art of living while invisible, would survive its trials. And somewhere beyond the rosewater-scented corridors, the empire waited, indifferent, patient, unyielding. The Sultan would call for the chosen, the shadows would shift, and the dance of fear and beauty would continue, relentless and eternal. Alira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her, yet also the fragile flicker of determination that refused to die. The procession of flesh had begun, and Alira understood its cruel truth. In the harem, innocence was a weapon, obedience a shield, and survival was the only victory worth claiming. The palace seemed to breathe as night fell over Constantinople, a living, breathing labyrinth of stone and silk, perfumed corridors, and flickering candlelight. The call to prayer echoed from distant minarets, a haunting refrain that reminded all within the walls of the world beyond, a world Alira could no longer touch. Tonight, the Sultan would choose. Tonight, lives would be elevated or erased with a simple glance, a gesture, a whisper. Alira sat in her chamber, her fingers brushing over the delicate embroidery of her robes, tracing the patterns of flowers and crescents stitched with gold thread. The fragrance of rose and sandalwood clung to her, a mask meant to allure and impress. Her heartbeat thrummed in her ears, loud and relentless, each pulse a reminder of the peril she faced. The Sultan's gaze could be both salvation and sentence. To be summoned was a privilege fraught with danger. To fail was a quiet death, hidden behind the palace's gilded walls. She remembered the older girls' whispered stories, tales of those who had pleased him, rising swiftly into the inner sanctum, and those who had faltered, disappearing so completely that even their names vanished from memory. Some said that the Sultan's favor was intoxicating, that it promised power beyond imagining. Others said it was a trap, a gilded noose that would strangle the unwary. Elira did not know which was true, but she understood the certainty of one thing: tonight, her life would change forever. The eunuch appeared silently, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to follow, and she obeyed, stepping carefully across the marble floor, her silk slippers barely making a sound. The corridors stretched endlessly, lined with mirrors that reflected her image 100 times over. In each reflection, she saw a girl both familiar and foreign, terrified yet compelled to survive. Every movement was scrutinized, every step measured. There was no room for error, no allowance for hesitation. At last, they reached the inner chamber. The doors, tall and carved with gold leaf, opened to reveal the Sultan himself, seated upon a throne of ebony and gold. His presence was overwhelming, not merely a man, but an embodiment of empire, of power absolute and terrifying. Candles flickered around him, casting shadows that danced across the walls, making the room seem both larger and more suffocating. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the girls who had been brought before him, calculating, measuring, judging. Elira's breath caught in her throat. The stories had not prepared her for the reality of his presence. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest. Every instinct screamed to bow, to avert her gaze, yet some part of her knew she must hold herself steady. To falter was to invite ruin. To be seen clearly, to present herself fully, was both terrifying and necessary. A soft bell rang, signaling the beginning of the selection. The girls stepped forward, one by one, their movements rehearsed, deliberate, graceful. Some trembled, others moved with studied composure. The Sultan's eyes lingered, assessing, testing, weighing the delicate balance between fear and allure. Elira's turn came, and she stepped forward, each motion a conscious act of survival. She held her chin high, her gaze forward, fingers lightly clasped in front of her. Every breath was measured, every heartbeat a silent prayer. The Sultan's gaze met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to still. She felt the weight of centuries upon that look, the accumulated power of an empire, the authority to command life and death, the subtle cruelty embedded in a glance. Elira's body tensed, yet she forced a calm she did not feel. In the flickering candlelight, she understood the gravity of her fate. This encounter could define everything, lift her into splendor, or consign her to a shadow from which she might never return. Elira felt the weight of every eye in the chamber, though none dared speak. The other girls were frozen in delicate poses, their beauty and fear intertwined like threads of silk. The Sultan's gaze moved slowly, deliberately, lingering where he chose, dismissing others with a subtle flick of his hand. Each selection was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet final. The air itself seemed to tremble with tension. She remembered the lessons whispered by the older concubines: never appear too eager, never too timid, never too ordinary. Each trait could betray a girl, and each flaw was magnified under the scrutiny of absolute power. Elira had memorized the rules, studied the subtle signs of favor, the faint inclinations of attention, and the shifts of shadows across the Sultan's face. Tonight, theory and observation would be tested in the most intimate and terrifying manner possible. A eunuch stepped aside, signaling her forward. Elira's heart pounded, but her steps were steady, rehearsed. The scent of sandalwood grew stronger, mingling with the faint copper tang of fear that clung to her skin. She knelt briefly before the Sultan, as tradition demanded, her gaze lowered but her posture impeccable. Every movement was a negotiation with fate. Every breath a measured offering. The Sultan's voice broke the silence, soft, almost musical, yet carrying the authority of a man whose word was law. He asked her name, her origin, the language of her homeland. She answered clearly, each syllable deliberate, mindful of the power in her voice. A tremor in the tone could have marked her as unfit, yet she forced it into smooth, calm resonance. The Sultan's eyes did not leave her face, and she felt the terrifying weight of being fully seen, fully judged. Moments passed that felt like hours. In the hush of the chamber, she became acutely aware of the silk of her robes against her skin, the faint ache in her legs from kneeling, the chill of the marble beneath her fingertips. These small sensations, trivial in another life, now seemed monumental. Survival depended on perception, on control, on hiding fear behind the mask of grace. A subtle gesture, a nod, a narrowing of the Sultan's eyes, these were the signals of favor or doom. Alira held her posture, allowing only the smallest of smiles, carefully measured, her eyes steady yet gentle. She understood that the game was not one of beauty alone, but of presence, of command, of invisible diplomacy in the shadow of a man whose desire could grant life or snuff it out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Sultan rose. The gesture was both simple and catastrophic, a sign that she had been noticed, chosen to ascend one step higher in the hierarchy of the harem. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the awareness that this was merely the first stage. Favor was fleeting, as mercurial as the candlelight dancing on the gilded walls. A moment of carelessness, a word spoken incorrectly, a glance misplaced, and all could vanish. The eunuchs led her back through the corridors, the soft echo of her footsteps marking her passage. Other girls watched in silence, some with envy, others with dread. The unspoken message was clear. Tonight, she had survived the Sultan's gaze, but tomorrow, the trials would continue. The harem was a world of shifting shadows, where power was hidden in subtle gestures, where alliances and betrayals were measured in whispers. As Alira returned to her chamber, the silk of her gown brushing against the marble floor, she felt both triumph and terror. She had passed the first test, yet the harem demanded more than mere compliance. It demanded ingenuity, patience, and the courage to navigate an intricate web of power, desire, and danger. Every night, she would face the Sultan's attention. Every day, she would endure the silent scrutiny of women who wielded their own hidden authority. Lying on her narrow mattress that night, Alira reflected on what survival truly meant. The Sultan's favor was a gift, yet also a burden, a constant reminder that life in the harem was a precarious balance between visibility and invisibility, power and subjugation. And though fear pressed down upon her like a stone, a flicker of resolve burned within, she would endure, adapt, and survive. For even in a palace filled with beauty, her humanity, her soul, could remain her own, if she were careful enough to preserve it. The hours passed with a hypnotic rhythm, measured by the soft clink of chains, the whisper of silk, and the distant echoes of the Sultan's laughter as he moved unseen through the palace. Alira lay on her thin mattress, the candlelight casting shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to twist and lengthen like the long reach of the empire itself. Sleep was elusive. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant sigh of another girl, sharpened her awareness, reminding her that the harem was never truly silent. She thought of the other girls, some chosen, some passed over, all bound by the same invisible chains. Each carried her own story of fear and loss, of stolen childhoods and shattered families. Alira's heart ached for them, yet she knew that sentiment could be dangerous. Sympathy, misplaced, could be a weakness in a world where survival demanded vigilance, cunning, and self-preservation. To endure, she had to transform sorrow into silent strength, grief into patience. Night deepened. A soft knock at the door signaled another eunuch, silent as a shadow, come to escort the chosen girls to their next stage. Alira rose, smoothing the folds of her gown, her heart a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. The corridor outside smelled faintly of rosewater and damp stone, the walls echoing every step. Other girls passed her, eyes averted, their own fears mirrored in the quiet intensity of her gaze. Together yet alone, they moved like ghosts through the palace, ornaments of power, yet prisoners of it. The inner chamber awaited, a place where silk and gold masked the harshest of realities. Here, the Sultan's influence was absolute. Here, obedience was life, defiance was death. Alira stepped forward, each motion deliberate, a careful performance honed by weeks of observation and study. She had learned the art of invisibility, to appear present but unassuming, to project calm while her heart raced with terror. It was a dangerous dance, and one misstep could unravel everything. She knelt once again, head bowed, hands folded in careful repose. The Sultan's gaze fell upon her, steady, commanding, and impossible to evade. In that moment, Alira felt the full weight of centuries pressing upon her, the accumulated authority of an empire capable of granting life, pleasure, and power, or erasing them entirely. The chamber seemed to contract, the air thick with tension and the faint metallic tang of fear. A subtle nod, a faint smile, and she felt the first fragile thread of favor. Yet Alira knew better than to celebrate. Favor in the harem was as ephemeral as candlelight. It could be granted, withdrawn, or redirected at the Sultan's whim. Every day would be a test, every night a negotiation, every glance a careful calculation. She had survived this moment, but survival was only the beginning. As she was escorted back through the gilded corridors, the soft rustle of silk a reminder of both privilege and peril, Alira understood the full scale of her captivity. The Sultan's attention was intoxicating, terrifying, and absolute. The harem was not merely a prison of beauty, it was a crucible that tested spirit, intelligence, and courage. Those who endured did so by mastering the subtle arts of deception, observation, and self-preservation. Returning to her chamber, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Her body was exhausted, her mind alert with the knowledge of what had transpired. She thought of her village, of the mountains, of the wind that had once whispered freedom in her hair. Those memories were fragile yet vital, a lifeline to a self the empire could not yet claim. She vowed that, though her body now served the Sultan's desire, her mind, her essence, would remain her own. Alira lay back on the narrow mattress, the soft scent of rose and sandalwood mingling with the lingering ache of tension. In the quiet, she realized that the Sultan's night was not merely an event, it was a lesson. Survival demanded not only beauty, obedience, and grace, but intelligence, cunning, and an unwavering will to endure. To navigate the harem was to play a game whose rules were written in fear, power, and subtlety. And she intended to play, and to survive. The candle flickered, shadows stretched across the walls, and the empire slept, or pretended to. Alira closed her eyes, the faint pulse of hope intertwined with fear. Tonight she had endured, tonight she had survived. And tomorrow, the game would continue. The harem, as the world outside imagined it, was a paradise of silk, perfume, and beauty, but within its walls, it was a kingdom ruled by unseen empires, whispers, and subtle power. The Sultan reigned with absolute authority, yet the true governance of the palace often rested in the hands of women who had survived long enough to learn its hidden laws. They were the concubines, the advisors, the manipulators, each wielding influence as quietly and sharply as any sword. Alira soon discovered that navigating this hidden empire required intelligence, observation, and a mind capable of discerning the invisible threads that controlled life and death. Days blended into nights, each measured by strict rituals and the constant gaze of the Sultan's eyes, whether real or imagined. The young girls were bathed, perfumed, and adorned with the finest silks, yet all of these luxuries carried a price. Each decoration was a symbol of control, a gilded leash that reminded them of their captivity. Alira had begun to understand the subtle hierarchy. Older concubines with long experience held quiet power, their smiles masking shrewd calculations, their gestures signaling alliances and rivalries. Younger girls were trained to notice, to learn, to imitate, or to vanish quietly into obscurity. Alira watched them carefully, noting the way a flick of a wrist could command attention, how a glance could seal alliances, how laughter could disarm suspicion. She realized the harem was more than a prison of beauty. It was a crucible of intellect, cunning, and survival. Every smile, every compliment, every whispered conversation was a negotiation, a test of instinct and nerve. To endure meant more than pleasing the Sultan. It meant understanding the intricate social web and positioning oneself wisely. Some girls learned quickly, mastering subtle manipulations that allowed them small privileges. A favored corner of the garden, a softer mattress, a conversation that might reach the ears of the Sultan or his advisors. Others fell, unnoticed until they were sent to hidden chambers or disappeared entirely. Stories circulated, half-truths and legends, of girls who had been elevated to almost unimaginable influence, only to vanish under mysterious circumstances. The palace itself seemed alive, a silent arbiter, rewarding cunning and punishing naivety. Alira began to train herself, observing not only the rules but the exceptions, the subtle gaps in authority where power could be quietly claimed. She noted which concubines wielded influence and how they communicated without speaking aloud. A glance could carry more weight than a command. A soft laugh could conceal a dagger's intent. Every day was a study, every night a rehearsal of strategy. Survival, she realized, was as much a game of intellect as a test of endurance and beauty. She also discovered that the harem was a world of contradictions. Luxury and suffering, pleasure and pain, were inseparable. The girls were pampered yet disciplined, adored yet controlled, elevated yet always watched. Every privilege was a reminder of the chains that remained invisible. The empire had claimed their freedom, yet the women within it had found ways to wield their own power, subtle and hidden, often invisible to the sultan himself. Alira's mind grew sharper with each passing day. She learned to anticipate movements, to detect shifts in alliances, to measure the intentions behind every gesture. She discovered small acts of resistance, secret conversations, coded glances, all the silent rebellions that allowed women to survive within a system designed to erase them. Each lesson brought a bit of clarity. The harem was not merely a gilded prison, it was a battlefield, and only the clever, the patient, and the observant would endure. And so, in the shadow of silk and gold, Alira began to carve her own place, carefully, cautiously, aware that even the smallest miscalculation could erase her from this hidden empire. The Sultan's attention remained a looming presence, but she had begun to understand that power in the harem was not only about pleasing him, it was about mastering the invisible laws of survival, learning to walk the delicate line between visibility and discretion, influence and invisibility. The days grew longer, the lessons harsher, and the rules of the hidden empire clearer. Alira now understood that survival demanded more than obedience or beauty. It required a mind alert to every nuance, the tilt of a head, the flicker of an eye, the subtle pause in a conversation. In the harem, silence could speak louder than words, and an unseen gesture could shift the balance of power. Every concubine she observed was both teacher and warning, demonstrating the fragile line between influence and ruin. Alira began to cultivate her own subtle authority. She learned to move without drawing unnecessary attention, to smile at the right moments, to appear delicate while concealing vigilance. A hand lightly touching a robe, a glance toward a favored eunuch, a measured tilt of the head, each became a carefully calculated instrument in her survival. She realized that, while the Sultan's favor could elevate, it was the quiet mastery of these invisible forces that ensured continued existence and eventual power. The older women, who had endured years or even decades within these walls, were both guides and predators. They whispered advice, revealed secrets only to select confidants, and simultaneously observed for weakness. Alliances were fluid, friendships were tested by envy, by fear, by the shifting whims of the Sultan himself. Alira watched the careful dance of influence, noting the patterns of power, the subtle hierarchies hidden beneath perfumed luxury. At night, when the palace seemed to exhale, the girls gathered in quiet corners, exchanging information in whispers, their voices low and careful. They shared small triumphs and subtle defeats, teaching each other the secret language of survival. It was here that Alira learned the most, not from instruction, but from observation and experience. She discovered that influence was often invisible, a carefully timed smile, a shared secret, a word spoken to the right ear. Every interaction was a negotiation, every gesture a potential weapon or shield. Yet even in this clandestine education, danger lurked. One wrong glance, one misinterpreted word, could undo months of careful strategy. Stories circulated of girls who had vanished overnight, their names erased from memory, their existence reduced to rumor and cautionary tales. These whispers, often exaggerated, were warnings etched into the consciousness of every new girl. The harem rewarded intelligence and cunning, but it punished recklessness with absolute finality. Alira became meticulous, observing not only those who held power but also those who sought it. She noted the subtle alliances between concubines and eunuchs, the secret favors exchanged for information or loyalty, and the delicate balance between visible charm and hidden shrewdness. Slowly, carefully, she began to navigate this web, her survival no longer dependent solely on pleasing the Sultan, but on understanding and manipulating the invisible currents of influence within the palace walls. The Sultan remained a looming presence, his attention unpredictable and absolute, yet Alira had begun to see that the true empire of the harem was maintained by women themselves. In whispered conversations, in silent glances, in the unspoken rules that govern movement, speech, and behavior, power flowed quietly yet decisively. Those who understood it could survive, those who did not were erased. Alira reflected on the transformation she was undergoing. The girl stolen from her village, trembling among chains and fear, was slowly becoming something else, cautious, alert, calculating. She was learning not just to survive, but to participate in the hidden empire, to claim her own place within the delicate hierarchy that determined life and death. And though the luxury and beauty around her masked the brutality of her world, she understood that mastery of this realm required intelligence, patience, and a keen understanding of human desire and fear. In this world of shadows and silk, Alira found both her greatest peril and her only path to power. The Sultan's attention remained a constant variable, but the hidden empire of women offered her a chance not just to endure, but to shape her destiny. She had survived the first trials, earned a fragment of favor, and learned the rules of the invisible court. Now she would navigate it, slowly and deliberately, aware that every gesture, every word, and every choice carried the weight of life or oblivion. By now, Alira had begun to see the harem not merely as a prison, but as a complex world of strategy, survival, and subtle dominion. She understood that the walls of gold and silk concealed more than beauty. They held a labyrinth of ambition, rivalry, and fragile power. Every smile, every bow, every whispered word had meaning. To survive, she would need to move like a shadow, aware of every possibility, every threat, and every opportunity. The senior concubines, those who had endured years of scrutiny and survived countless competitions for favor, became her guides and warnings. One whispered a lesson while brushing hair behind her ear. "Observe, never trust completely, and let no one see the fear in your eyes. Fear is currency for those who know how to exploit it." Another watched her silently, noting every hesitation, every glance, weighing her potential for influence. Each interaction, subtle as it seemed, was part of a larger game that determined position, security, and survival. Alira began to practice patience as an art form. In the harem, haste was fatal, impulsivity deadly. She learned to wait, to study, to anticipate the moves of others, much like a chess player considering multiple turns ahead. She discovered that power often lay not in visibility but in quiet influence. A carefully placed word, a discreet alliance, a timely act of kindness or subtle manipulation. These were the tools of survival, and the girls who mastered them often wielded more authority than the Sultan himself could perceive. But the harem was also a place of deep cruelty. Rivalries erupted in sudden bursts of jealousy and deception. A seemingly innocuous smile could ignite suspicion, a misinterpreted gesture could provoke punishment. Alira saw girls exiled to hidden quarters, their existence erased by silent orders and secret malice. Fear was omnipresent, yet those who learned to harness it, who concealed it and observed carefully, could turn it to advantage. As weeks turned to months, Alira began to understand that the Sultan's attention, while terrifying, was only one part of a larger system. The hidden empire of women was the true structure that governed the harem, a subtle network of influence and control that shaped the lives of all who dwelled within its walls. By watching, learning, and carefully positioning herself, she could navigate this intricate web, survive the Sultan's unpredictable favor, and perhaps even claim her own measure of authority. Alira also discovered the secret power of knowledge. Information was currency, and those who knew the whispers, the hidden routines, and the concealed alliances could wield it with precision. Every conversation, every glance, every note of gossip held potential value. She listened, observed, and catalogued, learning who could be trusted, who was dangerous, and who might serve as allies in the unseen battle for influence. The palace, with all its beauty and terror, became both her classroom and her battlefield. Yet even as she learned to navigate the system, a quiet sorrow persisted. She missed her home, the wind in the mountains, the laughter of her family. The harem demanded the suppression of these memories, yet they remained a fragile lifeline to the self she refused to surrender. It was this inner strength, the memory of freedom and identity, that sustained her, even as the gilded walls closed tighter around her. In the end, Alira realized that survival in the harem required more than obedience, beauty, or cunning alone. It demanded adaptability, patience, and an unwavering commitment to self-preservation. The empire had taken her body, but her mind, her spirit, could remain her own. And in that subtle, hidden way, she began to carve a place for herself within the palace, a delicate power within a gilded cage, a flicker of autonomy amid the overwhelming authority of the sultan, and the unspoken dominion of women who had learned to endure. By nightfall, Alira lay upon her narrow mattress, the soft fragrance of roses and sandalwood clinging to her. She had endured, observed, and begun to understand. The harem, with all its beauty, cruelty, and hidden power, had revealed its lessons. And she, fragile yet resolute, was learning to navigate its treacherous currents, determined not just to survive, but to endure with dignity, intelligence, and the faintest spark of defiance. Time flowed differently within the palace walls. Years passed in a haze of silk, scent, and whispered intrigues, and the girls who had once arrived trembling and terrified became women of quiet strength, their every movement calibrated, their every word deliberate. Alira had survived the initial horrors of capture, the trials of the procession, and the Sultan's night. Now, she began to understand the deeper, more enduring lessons of life within the harem, that power was subtle, influence invisible, and survival a continuous negotiation between fear and cunning. The empire beyond the palace could shape kingdoms, wage wars, and dictate lives, but inside the harem, the rules were different. Women wielded authority in shadows, commanding resources, shaping perceptions, and managing the delicate ecosystem of fear and favor. Alira observed these dynamics with a careful eye. She learned to anticipate alliances, to detect subtle shifts in hierarchy, and to measure the intentions behind the softest glance. Knowledge had become her most potent weapon, and patience her strongest shield. Yet the harem was a place of contradictions. It was both sanctuary and prison, a realm of luxury and terror. The girls and women who lived within its walls were subjected to beauty, desire, and domination, but also to cunning, observation, and survival strategies that could rival the military tactics of the empire itself. Each act of elegance, each whispered word, each hidden gesture carried consequence. In these lessons, Alira began to sense the true power of those who endured, the ability to navigate a world where appearances masked intent and shadows held authority. Through careful observation, she learned to distinguish between genuine favor and fleeting attention. Some concubines wielded influence subtly, manipulating alliances and information to secure safety and opportunity. Others relied on charm, seduction, or brute cunning, only to falter when the Sultan's attention shifted elsewhere. Alira began to see the patterns, to recognize the invisible structures that governed life and death within the palace. She learned to move quietly, speak cautiously, and act deliberately, understanding that the cost of error was permanent and often invisible. The Sultan himself remained a constant, unpredictable force, a presence that could elevate or erase with a glance, a word, or a gesture. Yet even he was not omnipotent within the harem's complex social web. The women who had endured years within its walls could subtly manipulate outcomes, guide attention, and protect themselves and their allies. Power, Alira realized, was not merely granted by desire, it was claimed through intelligence, observation, and restraint. Survival had become not just an act of endurance but a disciplined strategy, a mastery of invisible forces. Alira also began to comprehend the toll this life demanded. Fear, vigilance, and constant calculation left little room for true friendship or trust. Each alliance was tentative, each conversation potentially a test. Love and loyalty were dangerous luxuries, often exploited by those who understood the harem's hidden mechanics. Yet in this crucible of desire and observation, she discovered a quiet resilience. Her memories of home, of mountains, of wind and freedom, became a source of inner strength, grounding her as she navigated the subtle currents of authority and survival. She reflected on those who had arrived before her, stolen from villages and cities, some lost entirely, others transformed into agents of subtle power. Their legacy was woven into the palace, lessons, strategies, and warnings passed down in silence, shaping the next generation of girls who arrived trembling at the gates. Alira saw herself as part of this continuum, a participant in an unbroken chain of survival, learning to endure, adapt, and wield influence within a realm that demanded constant vigilance. And in the quiet moments, when the palace seemed to breathe and the distant sounds of the city drifted faintly through the corridors, she understood the ultimate lesson. The harem's legacy was not merely beauty or desire, but survival, intelligence, and the quiet, unseen power of those who endured. Here, in the shadows of silk and gold, she had discovered a realm where resilience was more valuable than favor, and knowledge more potent than obedience. The years continued to shape Alira, carving from fear and hardship a resilience she had never known in her life beyond the palace walls. The harem was no longer a labyrinth of terror. It had become a world she understood, a kingdom ruled as much by cunning and observation as by the sultan's whim. She moved with quiet confidence, her gestures precise, her expressions carefully measured. Every glance, every nod, every smile became a tool in the delicate architecture of influence she had learned to construct. Evenings were the most revealing. When the candlelight flickered across the walls, revealing shadows that seemed alive, the concubines would gather in small circles, exchanging information, alliances, and warnings. These gatherings were never official, yet they were the pulse of the hidden empire. Alira listened more than she spoke, understanding that power lay in knowledge and discretion. A whispered secret could tip the balance of favor. A concealed observation could protect a life. In these quiet hours, she learned the invisible mechanisms that sustained the harem and allowed women to survive, even thrive, despite the omnipresent shadow of the sultan. She discovered the subtle economy of influence, small favors, carefully timed smiles, the strategic withholding of information. Even a gesture as simple as an approving nod to the right person could ripple across the palace, shaping alliances and loyalties in ways invisible to outsiders. Alira had come to understand that life in the harem was not simply about beauty or desire. It was about intelligence, patience, and the ability to navigate a labyrinth where one misstep could erase years of careful strategy. Yet the cost of this knowledge was never far from her mind. The harem demanded vigilance, and vigilance required suppression of self. Moments of fear, doubt, and grief were pushed aside, hidden behind a calm facade. The sultan's presence, though less immediate now, remained a force of potential catastrophe. A single miscalculated glance or poorly timed word could undo months of carefully built alliances. Survival was an ongoing negotiation with fear, and the palace was a classroom where every day was a test, every interaction a lesson. In the midst of these lessons, Alira found moments of quiet reflection. She remembered her family, the mountains of her childhood, the simple pleasures of freedom. These memories were her anchor, a reminder that despite the gilded cage, her humanity remained intact. The harem could control her body, dictate her movements, and demand her obedience, but it could not claim her mind, her memories, or the quiet spark of independence that had carried her through the earliest trials. Over time, she also learned the true reach of the sultan's hidden empire. It was a structure both fragile and unyielding, dependent not solely on his will but on the women who had endured, adapted, and mastered its subtle dynamics. The concubines wielded power quietly, shaping the lives of newcomers, influencing the sultan's perception, and preserving their own security. Alira became a participant in this cycle, a student of survival and influence, observing, learning, and gradually asserting her own quiet authority. But mastery brought its own burdens. Knowledge was heavy, responsibility constant, and trust nearly impossible. Every interaction required calculation, every gesture, a potential weapon or shield. She saw the sacrifices of those who had come before her, girls erased from memory, women whose cunning had failed them, and those who survived yet lost pieces of themselves to the relentless demands of survival. And yet, in witnessing these lives, Alira gained the insight to endure, to maneuver, and to retain her spirit amid the oppression. In the quiet hours of night, when the palace was hushed and only the soft rustle of silk filled the air, she reflected on her journey. From a frightened girl stolen from her village to a woman navigating the most intricate and perilous hierarchy of the harem, she had learned the art of survival, the power of observation, and the enduring value of patience. The lessons were brutal, yet they were a form of liberation. Knowledge and awareness allowed her to wield influence, maintain agency, and preserve the fragments of herself that the empire could never touch. Alira understood, at last, that the harem's legacy was not merely the stories of beauty, desire, or favor, but of resilience and subtle power. The empire outside could conquer lands, armies, and cities, but within these walls, women had learned to survive through intellect, strategy, and endurance. And in this legacy of shadows, Alira had carved her place, a quiet triumph amid the opulence and danger, a testament to the enduring strength of those who refused to be erased. Alira had come to realize that the harem was a mirror of the empire itself, a place where power was absolute, yet fragile, where beauty and desire were weapons, yet intelligence and patience were survival. Years of observation, calculation, and endurance had transformed her from a frightened girl into a woman capable of navigating a world of subtle dominance and unspoken hierarchies. Every smile, every glance, every carefully chosen word was now a tool she could wield, and she understood the delicate balance between visibility and discretion, influence and subservience. The Sultan's presence, though still formidable, no longer dictated every beat of her heart. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to read the hidden cues of favor and disfavor, and to understand that while he could elevate or erase, the enduring power within the harem rested largely in the hands of the women who had mastered its rules. These women, survivors of years of scrutiny and trials, had transformed fear into influence, manipulation into survival, and subservience into subtle authority. Alira aspired to join their ranks, not merely as a favored concubine, but as a participant in the unseen empire that shaped life behind the gilded walls. In quiet moments she reflected on the cost of this mastery. Each lesson had been paid for with fear, sleepless nights, and the constant suppression of her natural self. Trust was rare, friendship tentative, and every alliance carried the risk of betrayal. Yet in this crucible, Alira had discovered the enduring strength of resilience. She had survived the initial horrors, navigated the tests of attention and favor, and learned to manipulate the invisible currents of power that sustained life within the harem. In doing so, she preserved not only her life, but her identity, a rare and priceless triumph. Alira also understood the weight of memory. The harem was designed to erase, to reshape, to claim bodies and spirits alike. But memory remained her refuge. She remembered her village, the mountains, the wind, and the voices of her family. These recollections, fragile as they were, provided a lifeline to a self untouched by the empire's designs. They reminded her of the life she had lost, the freedom she might never reclaim, and the humanity she refused to surrender. In the midst of opulence and terror, memory became a quiet form of resistance, an assertion of self within a world that sought to suppress it. As the years passed, Alira's influence grew subtly yet undeniably. The new girls who arrived trembling and terrified looked to her for guidance, consciously or not. Her observation and quiet counsel allowed them to survive, and in return, she learned from them, adapting to each new challenge and each shifting dynamic within the harem. She became part of the cycle, a keeper of secrets, a guide through trials, a witness to the interplay of fear, desire, and ambition. The Sultan's favor remained a fluctuating force, yet the women's hidden empire had endured beyond fleeting whims, and Alira had found her place within it. She realized that the harem's legacy extended beyond the palace walls. Stories of its beauty, cruelty, and cunning would reach the empire outside, shaping perceptions and fueling myths. But within the walls, it was a realm of survival, strategy, and endurance, where women wielded quiet power and learned the art of living under the gaze of absolute authority. Elira understood that her experiences, her survival, and her growing influence were part of a continuum, a legacy of shadows passed from one generation of women to the next, each teaching the lessons of endurance, cunning, and resilience. In the end, Elira stood not merely as a survivor, but as a testament to the strength that could flourish even in a gilded cage. She had endured the terror, navigated the tests, and learned the subtle art of influence. The harem, with all its beauty, cruelty, and invisible hierarchies, had taught her that survival was not just about pleasing the powerful. It was about mastering oneself, understanding the unspoken rules, and transforming fear into quiet authority. And so, in the stillness of the palace, amid the scent of rosewater and the flickering candlelight, Elira breathed deeply, aware of the fragility and power of her existence. She had survived, she had endured, and she had claimed her place within the hidden empire of women. In the shadows of silk and gold, she had discovered not only survival, but the enduring strength of human resilience, a legacy that would echo long after the empire and the Sultan himself had faded into history.